Hello and welcome to the CNSS podcast. My name is Hamsini Hariharan and I'm a non-resident visiting fellow at the Center for National Security Studies at MS Ramaya University of Applied Sciences. India's relationship with Myanmar is at an inflection point. As the country grapples with a multi sided conflict, the weakening of the military junta, and the rise of powerful ethnic armed groups, New Delhi faces hard choices. How does India manage instability on its borders while advancing connectivity projects like Kaladan? How can it engage multiple power centers without being drawn into great power rivalries between China and the United States? My guest for today is uniquely placed to help us navigate these questions. Rami Niranjan Desai is an author, anthropologist, and researcher with over 2 decades of fieldwork experience studying insurgency, ethnic armed organizations, religion, and identity issues. She is a distinguished fellow at the India Foundation, where she focuses on the northeast of India and India's relations with its neighbors, including Myanmar. At the India Foundation, Rami also curates the flagship India Ideas Conclave. She hosts the podcast Insight and leads several key initiatives on regional security and policy. Rami has written multiple books, authored white papers, and contributes a regular column, Ramification, in First Post. Her work is widely published in national journals and magazines, and she's a frequent panelist on major English and Hindi news channels. Rami's insights are particularly important because she brings rare field based perspectives from her recent travels across Myanmar, where she engaged directly with ethnic groups and political stakeholders shaping the country's future. Here's the conversation with Rami at the CNSS podcast. Listen in. Ms. Rami Desai, welcome to the CNSS podcast. We're so happy to have you here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I know we've been trying to schedule this for a bit, and I'm so glad that we could make it happen today.
Yes, me as well. Considering that you are possibly one of the most prominent thinkers on Myanmar in India today, I think it's important that we have this conversation because Myanmar, also as sort of a strategic calculus for India, is growing more and more every day. And so I thought before we get into the weeds of it, we could start a little bit in the background. Why is India's approach to Myanmar unique or salient? Why would it be different from other countries like China or Australia or the US? Could you walk us through how India thinks about its approach to Myanmar?
So, first of all, let me just say this at the outset. I've been studying the North Asian, not just Bangladesh, all of this area for a really long time. Specifically, I started from the North. And I don't think anybody can ever be an expert because it's like an education and process. Every time you go on the field, you learn more because it is so layered. There are so many complexities, and we like to look at things as a whole because we have this urban lens going on where there is a certain level of homogeneity. But when you look at the Northeast, when you look at Myanmar, when you look at Bangladesh, you look at other countries, even Sri Lanka, Nepal for that matter, there isn't it's very diverse in nature. And I think that predominantly it's that diversity amongst all of these countries that connects India more than any other country. So, and Australia would not appreciate that kind of diversity, even though it appreciates in the modern sense of the word, but it's not a civilizational appreciation that India has. So when you look at the kind of ancient historical linkages that we have with Myanmar, whether it was kingdoms, whether it was the traders who have lived, who traveled from the south to Myanmar, to from the northeast to Myanmar. When you look at the religious connect, which is the Buddhist connect, when you look at the fact that a lot of our tribal communities have transnational ethnic ties, these are things that cannot be replicated anywhere else. Number two, let me say this. I think because I've spent post the coup, I've spent a considerable amount of time in Myanmar, in and out, and just trying to get a sense of how the people look at us, and many other areas that I was looking at. But one of the things that I was getting is a sense of this, and the people of Myanmar themselves look at India differently to China. China, they see the relationship as transactional. With India, they see the relationship as very holistic. It's give and take. India's never transactional. It's not wanted anything in return. It's the birthplace of Buddhism. Indian traders and businessmen that you see who are now second generation, third generation. And I was in Poland and I happened to visit some of the temples there, Hindu temples. You'll realize there's always the Buddha is always there. You'll realize that they've sort of merged into Burmese culture. They not only speak the language, they wear the clothes. They're not problematic at all of any of the diaspora there. So all of this has helped bind the India-Myanmar relationship far deeper than any other country. With China, there is this little difficulty that, China is manipulating their natural resources, that China is transactional in nature. But let me end this answer by saying this, that I think, India and Myanmar, apart from its historical connections, even the modern day actions that have been taken in terms of Operation Brahma post the earthquake, we were the first responders. We had humanitarian aid on ground within 24 hours. We had relief workers, rescue workers on ground. That means Indian boots on ground. Within 24 hours, we really gave the essential first uh, response to the common man in Myanmar. And I was there during the earthquake. So I was on the seventh floor. So I was a big part of the earthquake. So I know how people reacted. The first 5 hours, 10 hours, I had, people calling me saying that, can India distribute humanitarian aid immediately? Can you help this, that? Within 24 hours, it was there. And I had the same people calling me back saying, oh my God, it's here. know. So I think those things bind us very deeply.
That's incredible. I think I agree with you. Borders, at the end of the day, as we have inherited them, are a colonial concept for the most part. And there is sort of the historical ties, and this is very apparent for me because I'm from Chennai and we've always had sort of like Burmese Tamil crossings in history and pop culture, in food, and it's something that I've sort of lived with. But it also makes me wonder about sort of the flip side of it, which is that when you have shared geography, you also have shared security threats. And so there is sort of a security angle to some of the spillover as well. So, how would you look at that?
So beautifully tied in, Hamsini, and I compliment you on bouncing with the security aspect. But you're absolutely right. The boundaries, the borders that we see today are all colonial constructs. This is not how we thought. This is not how our societies worked. These are not how civilizations work. And one has to understand that for most part, a lot of our subjects, whether it's anthropology, whether it's sociology, whether it's even subjects associated to security and defense, they have been made around the Western lens. So it's an outsider perspective that is trying to engage. And that is what makes the narratives that, and the situation so much more complex for us to understand. Now, what, why were the boundaries cut the way they were? They were cut more in terms of the geography than in terms of tribal affinities. Therefore, if you look at it's not just about Myanmar and India. If you look at all of Africa, look at how Africa has been cut. It's straight borders like that. Uh, no old civilization can ever be demarcated like that, and therefore all the border problems and chaos and conflicts in Africa. So the same here in the Northeast as well. You have these borders that have been cut from a lens that does not understand tribal communities. Mm. And therefore, you have this way, that way. And again, I'm not saying that tribal communities, it's one big community. No, there are multiple communities, sub communities, there are affinities, there are marriages across lines. It doesn't mean they're just one homogeneous group. No. But there are so many permutations, combinations. And that has been the genesis of the problem, problem. It's also been the fact that even if you look at Myanmar, that tribal communities were more often than not used by the colonialists to fight for them as opposed to other mainstream communities. The nationalism hasn't been, let's say, equitable in its understanding across Myanmar, just the way it wasn't across India. Yes, we all had the idea of Bharat. We believed in that. Somewhere it was lost because there was a difference in our understanding of what India was. The same happened with Myanmar. So the tribal communities were more often than not coveted by the West. The Bamars had this sense of Bamar nationalism. Mm-hmm. That's why it has had a post-colonial history of conflict, wherein the military Tatmadaw has wanted to keep Burma as a whole. That's their predominant focus. And the tribal communities, some ethnic, not, I wouldn't just say tribal communities, I'd say different ethnicities. Tribal communities would be the wrong word to use. Some ethnic communities couldn't care less. So that even if they went independent, their aspirations would probably be more accommodated in their own autonomy than it would be under, the Tatmadaw. So there has been this split. Now, what has happened in that conflict that has ensued between the Bamars and the rest of the ethnicities, between the Tatmadaw, which is the armed forces, and the rest of the ethnic armed organizations, is that it's given for a lot of illegal activities to happen. The drug trade, whether it's the cyber scam. We know that Myanmar has the biggest drug trade in the world right now. It has the biggest cyber scam industries in the world right now, illegal gambling units. That also affects China, not just India. It has poppy cultivation. It has road tax collection. It has far too many ethnic armed organizations fighting for territory, and sometimes it overlaps. Now, what happens is that spillover also happens on the northeastern borders. Because 1643 kilometers that we share with Myanmar is porous. Maybe you can manage. A layman can keep saying, oh, the security forces can do what they want to do. Come on, 1643 kilometers for security forces to physically man would take the kind of manpower that would be incredible to imagine, would take the kind of money that we don't have. These are really difficult terrains. So what you do best is you man the areas that you know are penetrable. And you manage in different ways. Sometimes you have fencing, sometimes you have people manning it, forces manning it. Sometimes you have cyber security, so you can have it in multiple ways. However, you are only as good as your weakest point. And the weakest point, nobody knows better than the people who live on ground. And therefore, if you've seen the kind of drug wars that we've fought in the Northeast in the recent past, have been some of the largest. That means that larger amounts are coming in, but that also means that our security forces are very attuned to what is happening. Number two, you see the kind of weapons that have come in. Because again, porous borders, weapons will also come in. And anti-state actors will want to be able to manipulate that access towards conflict. Number three, apart from drugs and weapons, the fact that insurgent groups can go back and forth. So you even have Indian insurgent groups that are in Myanmar, safe haven when the country is in conflict. It doesn't get that much of a safe haven when the country is at peace. For them to come and attack this side and then go back becomes much easier. And of course you have the cyber scam industries and, which have become very problematic. So yeah, the security situation is a major priority for us right now.
Thank you for putting that across so succinctly. I think, a lot of times we think about how important it is to secure our borders, particularly, on the west with Pakistan, with China towards the east. But when we think about Myanmar, I think we often forget about how difficult this terrain is, right? And also that the armed forces are there to restore peace and then they leave because there is no space for them. And it's often an issue of governance that's there. And when Myanmar goes through conflict, and the absence of that governance also gives sort of that space for insurgent groups to flourish. And as you pointed out, a lot of times the routes for drugs and arms and, human smuggling are often the same. And so it's sort of these inroads that we need to be very careful about. You also mentioned sort of the Tatmadaw and the various ethnic armed organizations, but it also makes me now wonder, considering how fractured the political landscape in Myanmar is, considering how many different ethnicities, tribal groups, different ethnic groups there are, how does India prioritize who we engage with, formally, informally, across this landscape? How do we make sense of that?
So you see what's happened with, and please correct me, right? But you know what's happened with Myanmar is because it's been in a prolonged state of disturbance, conflict, because it has various armed organizations, ethnic armed organizations, over 200 they say. It's become very easy for external actors to manipulate them because you'll always need something on ground, whether you need international support, Western support, strategic support, tactical support. You always need philosophical support. You always need some support. And obviously, groups also splinter and splinter and splinter. So there'll always be some rogue elements wanting to gain power. Also, it also very often happens that multiple groups within the same ethnicities have been raised, one to be manipulated by somebody else and the other, somebody else. It happened a lot of times. So what has happened in the conflict is that we're starting to see the growth of external actors. Now, whether it's China's influence in Myanmar, China has had a growing influence in Myanmar, and it's a substantial influence. It's not an influence that you can brush away and say, "Arey, we shouldn't be focused on it." No, I think we must know what's happening around our neighborhood. We must know who is making inroads and to what extent. Now, China, for that matter, has exerted its influence in two ways. It not only has influence on the Tatmadaw, but it also has influence on the ethnic armed organizations. Now, that is a really balancing act for somebody to be able to do that, because necessarily you would think the way you would think is in a linear way, where you'd say that, well, if I'm going to be friends with Tatmadaw, I can't be friends with its opponents, right? But China is very quick on its strategic thinking. It's very quick on acting on it. It's very quick on being able to assert pressure and to be able to think long term. Therefore, as we already know, China has a lot of influence assets there in terms of the deep sea port. It has gas and oil pipeline. It wants to make a railroad, which hasn't started as yet, but it will follow the gas and oil pipeline. That means from Chakru port to Yunnan region, right across Myanmar. It will go like that. So that would pretty much mean that they have to take into confidence many of the stakeholders across that region, right? Which is pretty much all of them. And therefore, they've made this strategy. They actually have a special envoy for Myanmar, who is senior diplomat who will come in and who will negotiate between the ethnic armed organizations and the Tatmadaw. If the Tatmadaw feels that the EOs have extended into their territory, he has the power to get them to back off and vice versa. So this is the serious influence that we're seeing. Number two, we are seeing Chinese boots on the ground. And we are seeing them around the Chakru port in terms of there is a program called the Joint Security Venture Company that any country can have on ground to protect its assets, even India can have. But the Chinese have already taken hold of that and got, their boots on ground. But that's to protect their assets, right? But let me tell you, those assets go through the Rakhine area, which is controlled by the Arakan army. So they've been, understand the complexity. Even though they have a good relationship with Tatmadaw, they're able to have their boots and where their assets are in an ethnic armed organization controlled area. They also have a lot of influence in terms of a psychological influence. You're seeing a growth of population, intermarriage, in the northern areas anyway have non-descent population. But if you go to places like Mandalay, Pulan, which used to be largely Indian dominated, you will see a lot of Chinese influence there. So that sort of influence has increased. So that's Chinese influence. But then you have the Western influence as well. You have the United States, you have Europe putting sanctions on the Tatmadaw. You have the United States wanting to come in a big way, wanting to somehow counter China. We saw the recent development of the humanitarian corridor, which was proposed from Bangladesh, and it was proposed to go into Arakan. Yeah. So, and we know that that was US backed because if you connect the dots, and if you're watching closely, and I've written this in a lot of my articles, I've detailed it in my articles, one knew that something was coming. And humanitarian corridor was a way for the Americans to seemingly say that we are sending humanitarian aid into the Rakhine area, but corridors per se always end up getting militarized, ever work as just to send humanitarian aid. Plus, also the Arakanis never asked for the humanitarian aid.
I mean, if humanitarian aid programs worked the way that they were supposed to work and are intended to work, we would have no conflict, really.
So at least the corridors would be conflict free. But we've seen in many other places that the corridors themselves become very militarized. Weapons are transferred. Missionaries are being transferred. There is a big amount of trust deficit amongst the non-Christian groups in Myanmar against American missionaries and their interference in their religious beliefs. There are some ethnic groups like the Kachins, that are fairly predominantly Christian. But the Arakanis, let's say, are very Buddhist, and nationalistic also. They won't appreciate, if I may say so, any sort of religious interference on ground. So that is also something that they are wary about. Of course, then the other angle is, which I must point out, and I point out very often in a lot of my talks, is the whole debate on the critical earth minerals, because that also brings in stakeholding. You see that in the northern areas, you see that China mines a lot of really important critical earth, heavy rare earth elements, and it takes it from ethnic armed controlled areas. Obviously, illegal mining, illegally controlled in terms of illegal in terms of there aren't really any environmental laws or rules that anybody is really following. But it goes to China, it's processed in China, and 90% of it is bought by US. So if I was the US, yes, I would want my own inroads into Myanmar to mine it directly, because tomorrow there's a tariff war. If you remember, the first thing that China threatened the US with is that we'll put away our critical earth mining into you. So, of course, I'm sure the Americans would be interested in that as well. That's why they've actually demarcated just after this tariff war happened, and the Chinese said we're going to withdraw our sale of critical earth minerals. The US announced exploration in Balochistan. They've had counters also. Remember, this is very important for the West because they have green transition goals that are unrealistic. And how do you fulfill green transition goals? You fulfill them with critical earth or heavy rare earth elements, because your windmill turbines, your EV magnets are all critical earth minerals, and heavy rare earth elements are a requirement. From what you're saying, what I'm understanding is that there is definitely an aspect of special interest groups that want to control particular areas or supply routes, if you will. And this could be of illegal, could be of things that are illegal, whether it could be guns or drugs. And on the other hand, it could be things that are legal and very much in demand, such as rare earths and critical minerals and things like that. But something that I wonder in sort of the Chinese footprint, in terms of the US footprint, is they engage with ethnic armed organizations as well as with the Tatmadaw. And this is sort of a strategy at least China has employed also in, say, Balochistan. And it's something that hasn't fared very well in certain pockets in Pakistan. And so I'm wondering if there are parallels to it in Myanmar. Across the board, how do different ethnicities, I mean, it's very difficult to answer, I'm sure, but how do different ethnicities look at the role of China? Look, when you talk about critical earth minerals, heavy rare earth elements, remember it affects the common person on the ground. whether it's controlled by an ethnic armed organization or not, the land becomes untenable for 20 years, 30 years or so. The water system cannot be used. Nothing can be cultivated on the land. So there is a little bit of migration also that happens. Now, for example, a lot of this mining is in Kachin area. But having met the ethnic armed organizations, including KIA, I know that they don't share a trustful relationship with the Chinese. There isn't. They're doing it because you're selling critical earth minerals. You're making money, and it's a lot of money. But is there trust and faith? No. Do they want another sales point in terms of diversification? Anybody in any trade will tell you that you can't just have one person, as your client. You need to diversify. So, do they want other countries to batter them? Sure. Not only will it give them a leverage on the price point, but it definitely will make them less dependent on China. Now, when you look at Tatmadaw also, let me remind you that the Tatmadaw never had good relations with China. Forces in China have always had some amount of, antagonistic sort of relationship. But when a country is in conflict, you will see a lot of unholy alliances coming together that you wouldn't have thought would come together in other circumstances or situations. But in situations like this, yes, whatever the need is, partnerships will, those partnerships will come, in whatever form or function. But the US also, the West also, I have to say this, has to understand that constantly having some amount of stakeholding or footprint in countries like this may not bear you any benefit, because when you're looking at the Tatmadaw, you don't like the Tatmadaw, you had a difficult relationship with the Tatmadaw. Ethnic armed organizations, you think you can control them, but you've never been able to control them. Whether it is in Afghanistan or anywhere else, which, you have to leave countries, whether it's Iraq, whether it's Afghanistan, you've not been able to control the radicalized elements. You've not been able to control weaponized militias, groups that have certain very strong rooted ethnic identities. You've not been able to understand them, and therefore you've not been able to really have a long term plan with them. Now, on one hand, when you look at Bangladesh, an unelected government by all practical purposes, anybody would tell you, was engineered in the West. That interim illegal government, there is no pressure from the West really for them to have elections. The pressure has come from around the neighborhood. And now they say they'll have elections, but the chances are that the elections will get pushed forth, because I don't think the interim government wants to give up power. Is the interim government elected? No, it isn't. Who has made Mohammed Yunus the chief of the interim government? Nobody knows. Right? Yet the West is not pressuring them elections. But when it comes to Myanmar, you are pressuring the Tatmadaw to have elections, to have elections, to have elections, to the extent that you want to get involved with ethnic armed organizations. And I say involved not out of just speculation, but you have European organizations that are on ground in Myanmar negotiating between ethnic armed organizations. Why are you there? So this habit of policing the world, I think the West has to give up, because now we have to also understand that majority of the population comes from this region, in the global south, in the world. Public perceptions are going to make a difference in the long run. Goodwill that a lot of Western countries have in these countries will dissipate very quickly. So, just to have some amount of faith and footprint in these countries, I think the West also needs to limit its engagement.
I agree with you. I think the US's sort of interventionist foreign policy is one of the reasons why you have so much criticism against democracy as a whole and as a model. And I think the double standards, or the various standards, I don't think it's double anymore, the various standards that the West has is one of the reasons why countries are simply unable to meet them, because they're arbitrary. They serve somebody else's end game. And so you really can't see as a country what's in it for you. And so I understand sort of the why the Tatmadaw or any other players, to be honest, would be mistrustful of sort of the approach. And I think I also agree with you in the sense of maybe Western countries already need to recalibrate where they're coming from and what they're offering if they want stakeholders to really prioritize democracy in that sense.
Well, Hamsini, for Western stakeholders, and this is not me berating the West. I think there are some very good qualities there. There are values of human rights and so on and so forth. So this is not. I'm not going into this whole debate of into this debate by saying, oh, we must bash the West. No, but I think the West has to understand when you're not coming into a naturally Christian stronghold, or why that makes a difference is not because of the religion. It makes a difference because your lens becomes different. So where do your morals and your values come from? It comes from the religion that, you adhere to. For Christianity, it also comes from there. Now your morals, values, your idea of civilization, advanced person is very different to what an Eastern person's idea of all of this is. I'll give you an example. A civilized person in, let's say, in the Indian pantheon of, philosophies would be somebody who at the end of his life gives up everything, comes, sheds his clothes, leaves everything, all attachments. Probably we imagine him as a man with no belongings, meditating up in the Himalayas. But is that the same for the West? No. For the West, an advanced person, a very civilized person, is a person who has material wealth, who lives in comfort, who's been able to advance scientifically, who's been able to have a certain Ivy League level of education. Priorities are different. So when you come into these countries with that lens, which was exactly the problem right at the beginning of early Christianity, that early Christianity had with paganism, that the pagans don't have God, their gods are devils, that, they don't have moral values, they don't have philosophy. They tend to use that lens to understand us, which is not true of us, because not only do we have philosophy, we have scriptures, we have advanced government. If you go into any of the tribal communities, their administrative systems, their systems of governance are very, very advanced and, very evolved. If you're going to come in to preach, is what I'm saying, then it's not going to be very well appreciated. That is why even in communities and tribal communities that have been converted, the ethnic framework and identity still stays. If you go to a church, it's not just one common church. The churches are also bifurcated on the basis of the tribes and the sub-tribes. Ethnic identity is very vibrant. So these are things that are far and few, understand. They don't understand this. And therefore, the policies are based on this, including their foreign policies.
I can see why sort of the loopholes and sort of the philosophical underpinnings would definitely translate into policies that then have sort of practical consequences at the end of the day. And, when I think about the Indian case, then, slightly coming back to sort of this Indian rationale that we've been speaking about. I read this paper that you wrote recently about how the Kaladan project could be the linchpin around which India manages instabilities. And we've spoken a lot about the northeastern borders and ethnic armed forces. So I'm wondering, what is this rationale that guides practical policies in Myanmar for India? How do we measure impact? How do we measure success, considering how difficult this landscape is to operate?
See, if it's difficult for us, it's difficult for the others as well. But not being a footprint would mean disaster for us. Now, when I say that we must have some stakeholding in the Rakhine state through a Kaladan multimodal project, it's for a couple of reasons. One, that the Kaladan multimodal project is extremely important to us because it gives us an alternative route to the chicken's neck. Yes, it has been on the back burner and, it's been a very difficult project. It goes through some difficult areas, there have been problems in constructing the road that will lead it into Mizoram. That patch is really, and the soil is clay, It's really, you can't use it for transportation as it is right now. But there have been problems to construct it. But I really think we need to put a determined effort, and like very capable Minister of Shipping, Minister Sarvanan Sonowal, he said that it will be completed by 2027. I hope it's not just assurances. I hope it does happen because, like I said, it's number one very important because it gives us an alternate route. Number two, Arakan Army is unlike any of the other ethnic armed organizations. I would suggest India take it case by case. When I say negotiate with the Arakan Army, I don't say negotiate with all the other 200 ethnic armed organizations as well. No, only with Arakan Army. And here's the reason I say it. Not only will it allow us to safeguard our asset in Rakhine, which is so important to us, but Arakan is across our border. It's formidable. It's also, in a way, a buffer to keep the Rohingyas out. And let nobody misguide anybody by saying the Rohingyas are just refugees. That's whitewashing what is going on the ground right now. I think it's very, very important to contain the Rohingya problem. And I think that is a meeting point between the Arakan army and us. Now, if people say, oh, well, we should only negotiate with the Tatmadaw, sure, we should negotiate with the Tatmadaw because eventually the Tatmadaw is going to have elections and it is going to form a democratically elected government. And we must do what is overboard for Indian policy because we don't unnecessarily interfere where we don't need to. However, Arakan Army is not a part of the National Unity Government. The National Unity Government was the government in exile that came up post the 2021 coup, which was made up of various ethnic armed organizations. So there are many ethnic armed organizations that are part of it, but Arakan Army is not. What does that tell us? That tells us that the Arakan Army wants to go at it alone. That means if it gets a good deal from the Tatmadaw, it will take it. Will the Tatmadaw want to negotiate with the Arakan? I don't know, but all logic would tell you that Arakan is not a part of the NUG. That means it's not clubbed itself with the other ethnic armed organizations. So it could, and it's the most powerful and formidable ethnic armed organization right now in Myanmar. So if it could cut a deal with the Tatmadaw, it would only make it more powerful. And why would they do that? I'm sure those negotiations will take a long time, so on and so forth. But if they were to do that, India would only be in a win-win situation because it would have made its inroads in Arakan, it would have built its Kaladan multimodal project. The other thing is, I think it's very important to realize that these are the people that are across our border. It's not just about the armed organizations, it's about the young children, the young women, people who've known India very closely because naturally a lot of people are married across the border, but a lot of kids used to come to study in India, so even if you look at Aung San Suu Kyi, she studied in LSR. But the transnational ethnic communities all have come to India to study, not just study, even for medical aid. So to cultivate goodwill amongst the local populace, which we have, but you can't just depend on, oh, we had it and we continue having it. No, you have to keep cultivating it. It would happen if there is that kind of interaction. There is that kind of development of humanitarian aid channels. Just because it's controlled by an ethnic armed organization doesn't mean that you don't cultivate goodwill on the ground. And I don't even think the Tatmadaw would have a problem with that. Because the Tatmadaw's problem is not with the common man per se on ground. Their problem is with ethnic armed organizations and whatever their personal politics is.
Yeah, that sort of power brokering between the Tatmadaw and the ethnic armed organizations is a subject for a whole podcast by itself. So
Plus, it's also between them, where India comes in. If India comes in protecting its own assets, which India should, and I think India has an example in China, which it can say that if China can do it, why can't we? What prevents us? Number two, like I said, cultivating goodwill, which we already have, but keeping it going. And we've done that in Operation Brahma, and we should continue doing it. At the moment, the way it is across the borders, the northeastern borders, those regions don't have electricity. They don't have hospitals. Are not functional. This is where India can really come in and, provide these basic necessities on ground. There are also a whole lot of other details like food, medical essentials, even basics like X-ray machines,
Mm.
generators.
Mm.
Because that's not helping anybody out. That's just helping the common man out. So I think India's foreign policy has always been multi-pronged.
Mm.
It's not been that. It's always been very humanitarian in nature. We saw it during COVID as well. I think it should continue being that with the knowledge that things are changing, and we are we are wanting to be the regional stabilizing force, the regional power. We need to start acting like
Mm. That's fair. I think it's actually a good note to end this podcast on. So we'll stop here. But thank you so much for your time and for your insight. I really appreciate it. And I'm sure we're going to get you back for another episode soon. That brings us to the close of today's episode. In discussing Myanmar's multi sided crisis, Rami helped us connect the dots between conflict dynamics on the ground, humanitarian pressures spilling over into India's northeast, and the broader geopolitical context shaping the region. Her field based insights offer a nuanced view of how Indian policy can remain agile, protecting local communities, advancing developmental projects, and steering clear of strategic entanglements. The CNSS broadcast is brought to you by the Center for National Security Studies. The Center for National Security Studies, or CNSS, was founded in 2023 as a multidisciplinary center of excellence for the study, research, and dissemination of subjects of non traditional and traditional national security. CNSS was established by an MOU between MS Ramaya University of Applied Sciences and the Army Training Command. You can find out more about our work at cnss.msruas.ac.in.